The conference room fell silent as Preston Hartwell pointed directly at me. "And this," he said, his voice dripping with carefully measured contempt, "is exactly the kind of liability we can no longer afford to carry." 23 executives and board members turned to stare. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on the table in front of me, my expression neutral. Preston continued, building momentum. Outdated thinking, resistance to innovation, a drain on resources that could be better allocated elsewhere. He paused for effect, scanning the room to ensure everyone absorbed his words. Frankly, I'm not sure why we've tolerated mediocrity for this long. The projector behind him displayed my department's quarterly results, numbers he'd carefully cherry-picked and presented without context. To anyone unfamiliar with the full picture, they looked damning. Several executives nodded slowly. A few took notes. The board members' faces remained unreadable. Preston smiled, confident in his performance. "Questions?" he asked. Silence. Then applause started. Polite, professional clapping that echoed off the glass walls. Not for me. For him. For his bold leadership. For saying what apparently needed to be said. I didn't move. Didn't defend myself. Didn't speak. I simply met Preston's eyes across that long table and held his gaze until he looked away first. I'd worked at Meridian Tech for 11 years. Started as a junior analyst, promoted to department head within 4, then to senior vice president of operations 3 years ago. I wasn't flashy. Didn't play political games. Just delivered results consistently, while others took credit for surface-level wins. My department handled the infrastructure nobody saw, the systems that kept everything running, the relationships that prevented disasters, the quiet fixes that saved millions. When the cloud migration nearly collapsed 2 years ago, I'd worked 70-hour weeks to salvage it. When our largest client threatened to leave, I'd personally rebuilt that relationship over 6 months of late-night calls. When the merger with Cascade Industries almost fell apart over integration issues, I'd coordinated every technical detail. But none of that appeared in quarterly presentations. Preston made sure of that. He'd been CEO for 18 months, promoted from CFO after the previous chief executive retired. He valued optics over substance, presentations over performance. And he decided early that I represented everything he wanted to eliminate, quiet competence that didn't photograph well. So he'd systematically marginalized my contributions, reassigned my wins to others, and framed my department as a cost center rather than the foundation holding everything together. Most people didn't notice. They saw his confidence and assumed it meant capability. Preston Hartwell understood power in a specific way, through visibility, control, and the careful construction of narrative. He held meetings designed to showcase his authority. He spoke in sound bites that sounded profound but meant nothing. He cultivated relationships with board members through golf and expensive dinners, not through actual results. In presentations, he dominated. His voice never wavered. His slides were slick and persuasive, even when the data was misleading. He had a talent for making problems disappear on paper while they festered underneath. Staff feared him because he was unpredictable, generous with praise one moment, cutting the next. He kept people off balance intentionally, believing it maintained his edge. He promoted visible winners and quietly pushed out anyone who might overshadow him. That's why my continued presence bothered him. I didn't compete for attention, but my work was too solid to ignore completely. People in the company knew who actually kept things running. That quiet recognition threatened him more than any direct challenge would have. So he decided to eliminate the threat by publicly reframing my competence as liability. Make me look incompetent before removing me. Control the narrative completely. It was calculated, strategic, and perfectly executed. The room had believed every word he said. That's what made him dangerous. Not that he was cruel, but that he was convincing. After the meeting ended, executives filed out quickly, avoiding eye contact with me. A few offered tight, sympathetic smiles that felt worse than nothing. I gathered my materials, slowly, deliberately. My hands didn't shake. My expression remained calm. Inside, something had crystallized. Not rage exactly, but absolute clarity. Preston had just made a critical error. He'd humiliated me publicly, yes. But more importantly, he'd shown the board exactly who he was. As I stood to leave, I noticed one board member remained seated. Helena Winters, the longest-serving board member and chair of the governance committee. She was in her late 60s, sharp as broken glass, and famous for saying very little while seeing everything. She watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Our eyes met briefly. She gave the smallest nod, not sympathy, not encouragement, just acknowledgement. Then she stood and left without a word. That tiny interaction shifted something in me. Helena Winters didn't waste attention on people who didn't matter. If she was watching, there was a reason. I walked back to my office, closed the door, and sat at my desk. The quarterly reports Preston had misrepresented were still open on my screen, the full versions, with context he deliberately omitted. I stared at them for a long time. Then I opened my email and began writing a very careful summary. I could have defended myself in that meeting. Could have stood up and presented the full data, exposed Preston's selective framing, forced a confrontation. Part of me had wanted to. But I'd learned something over 11 years at this company. Timing mattered more than truth. Shouting facts at people who'd already formed opinions rarely changed minds. It just made you look desperate. So I'd stayed silent. Let Preston's performance play out uninterrupted. Let him believe his narrative had landed perfectly. That silence was strategic, not surrender. I wanted him confident. Wanted him to think I was cornered, neutralized, no longer a concern. Because confident people get careless. They overreach. They make mistakes. Over the next few days, I worked exactly as I always had. Responded to emails professionally. Attended meetings. Delivered reports. Showed no sign that anything had changed. Colleagues approached me cautiously, offering awkward sympathy. That was rough in there, one said. Preston was out of line. I just smiled and changed the subject. Let them think I was quietly accepting my fate. Let the gossip spread that I was finished. Because while everyone focused on my apparent humiliation, I was documenting everything. Every decision Preston had made that I'd quietly fixed. Every risk he'd taken that I'd mitigated. Every cost he'd hidden that I'd absorbed. They thought my silence meant agreement. They had no idea it meant preparation. What Preston didn't understand, what most people didn't understand, was that my real work happened in places he never looked. My title was Senior Vice President of Operations, which sounded administrative and forgettable. But operations meant I touched everything. I knew which systems were fragile. I knew which client relationships were held together by personal trust. I knew which employees were flight risks and which were irreplaceable. I knew where the company's actual vulnerabilities were because I spent 11 years shoring them up. When the European division nearly collapsed from regulatory issues, I'd coordinated the response across 6 countries and 4 languages. When our main competitor tried poaching our engineering team, I'd restructured compensation and retention strategies to stop the exodus. When the supply chain bottleneck threatened to delay our flagship product launch, I'd personally negotiated with 7 suppliers to create alternative channels. None of this appeared in Preston's presentations. Operations work is invisible when it succeeds. You only notice it when it fails. Preston treated my department like overhead, necessary but generic, easily replaced. He had no idea that I'd built personal relationships with 40 key stakeholders across the industry, that I served on advisory boards for 3 major clients, that I'd mentored half the senior management team, that my institutional knowledge was the only thing preventing catastrophic failures in at least 6 critical areas. The board knew, though. At least some of them did. They'd seen my work over a decade, and they were about to pay much closer attention. Preston's greatest risk was that he believed his own presentations. He convinced himself that success came from vision and confidence, not from the grinding daily work of actually running a complex organization. Over 18 months as CEO, he'd made decisions that looked brilliant on slides but created enormous hidden costs. He'd cut operational budgets to boost short-term profits, which meant deferred maintenance on critical systems. He'd pushed aggressive expansion into new markets without proper infrastructure support, which meant my team worked around the clock preventing disasters. He'd promised features to clients that our engineering couldn't deliver, which meant I spent months managing expectations and preventing lawsuits. He'd hired expensive consultants who recommended restructuring that would have destroyed our most valuable informal networks. I'd quietly blocked that. And crucially, he'd lied to the board. Not obviously, not in ways that were immediately provable. But he consistently presented optimistic projections that didn't match operational reality. He claimed credit for successes that were years in the making before he arrived. He'd hidden problems that I was actively managing. The board had started noticing discrepancies between his confident reports and the actual quarterly results, between his claims about efficiency and the staff turnover rates, between his vision and the growing operational problems. That's why Helena Winters had been watching me so carefully. She was looking for someone who actually knew what was happening, and I'd just been publicly framed as a liability, which meant I had nothing left to lose. 3 days after the quarterly meeting, I received an unexpected calendar invitation. No context, just a time in a conference room I didn't recognize. The invite came from Helena Winters' assistant. I arrived 5 minutes early. The room was small, private, in an executive wing I rarely visited. Helena sat alone, reading something on her tablet. She glanced up when I entered. "Close the door, please." I did. "Sit." I sat. She studied me for a moment. "You didn't defend yourself in the quarterly meeting." "No." "Why not?" "Because nobody wanted to hear it," I said simply. They'd already decided what they believed. "And you're comfortable being called a liability in front of the entire executive team?" "I'm comfortable knowing what's true," I replied. "What other people believe about me is their problem." A slight smile touched her face. "The board is conducting a leadership review," she said. "Comprehensive evaluation of executive performance, operational efficiency, strategic alignment. It's been in progress for 2 months." That was news to me. I didn't know. No one did except 3 board members and our external consultants. We wanted unfiltered data. She set her tablet down. "Your name has come up repeatedly, in a very different context than Preston presented." I waited, saying nothing. "We'd like your cooperation," she said. "Full documentation of operational realities. No speculation, no editorializing. Just facts about what's actually happening at the ground level." I met her eyes. "I can provide that." "Good. We'll be in touch." I stood to leave. At the door, I paused. "Does Preston know about this review?" "No," Helena said. "And it needs to stay that way." Over the next 6 weeks, I had 4 more private meetings with board members and their consultants. They asked detailed questions about operations, systems, client relationships, risk management. They requested documentation I'd been maintaining for years. They interviewed my staff, my clients, my cross-functional partners. I provided everything they asked for. Factual, thorough, carefully documented. I didn't editorialize, didn't attack Preston, didn't position myself as a victim or a hero. Just gave them accurate information about how the company actually functioned versus how it appeared in executive presentations. The consultants were thorough, professional, relentless. They audited decisions, traced problems back to their sources, identified patterns. They interviewed people at every level. They reviewed emails, reports, budget allocations. They built a complete picture of what was actually happening behind Preston's polished narratives. Through all of this, I maintained my normal work routine. Attended meetings. Delivered reports. Stayed quiet. Preston noticed nothing. Why would he? He'd already dismissed me as irrelevant. In one meeting, he actually joked about my diminished role to other executives. They laughed uncomfortably. I smiled politely and said nothing. Let him think he'd won. Then one afternoon, Helena's assistant called me directly. "Ms. Winters would like to see you. Today at 5. Same conference room." When I arrived, 3 board members sat at the table. Helena, plus 2 others I recognized. "We have a question for you," Helena said without preamble. "If offered, would you be willing to serve as CEO of this company?" The room went very quiet. I looked at each of them. "Yes," I said. "I would." What followed was the most intense 3 months of my professional life. The board conducted exhaustive due diligence, not just on my capabilities, but on everything. My leadership style, my strategic thinking, my ability to handle pressure. They observed me in meetings. They interviewed everyone I'd ever worked with. They stress-tested my judgment with hypothetical scenarios. They reviewed every decision I'd made over 11 years. They brought in organizational psychologists to assess my temperament. They had me present to subcommittees on operations, strategy, culture, risk. They questioned my financial literacy, my communication skills, my vision for the company's future. It was grueling, but I understood why. They were betting the company's future on this choice. They couldn't afford to get it wrong. Through all of it, I maintained my regular job, kept managing operations, kept fixing problems, kept my head down while they evaluated whether I could lift my head up. Preston noticed nothing. He was too busy with his own priorities, polishing presentations, courting potential acquisition targets, reshaping the executive team to remove anyone who might challenge him. At one point, he actually told me my role would be redesigned in the next quarter. I smiled and said I understood. Inside, I knew exactly what was coming. The board's timeline was aggressive but careful. They wanted everything locked down before announcing anything. Wanted no room for Preston to maneuver, no ambiguity, no possibility of a power struggle. Finally, one evening in late September, Helena called me personally. "The board voted this afternoon," she said. "Unanimous. You'll be announced as CEO at the quarterly meeting next week." I sat down slowly. "Thank you. Don't thank us yet. You'll have to earn it." "I know. One more thing," Helena said. "Preston will be in that room when we announce it. We're not giving him advance notice. We need his reaction on record for documentation purposes." I understood what she wasn't saying. They needed to see if he'd accept this gracefully or burn the company down. "I can handle that," I said. 2 weeks before the announcement, Preston called an unexpected all-hands meeting. Something about organizational excellence and raising the bar. I attended with everyone else, sitting in the back of the auditorium. Preston took the stage with his usual confidence. He talked about accountability, about removing obstacles to progress, about making tough decisions for the company's future. Then, he turned to a slide with my department's name on it. "Some of you may have noticed we're restructuring operations," he said. "Moving away from legacy approaches that no longer serve us. We need leaders who embrace change, not people stuck in old ways of doing things." He was setting up my removal, preparing the company for my exit, making it seem logical, inevitable, already decided. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few glanced back at me. I kept my expression neutral. After the meeting, colleagues approached me with sympathy and outrage. "He's targeting you specifically," one said. "This is ridiculous. He's making a huge mistake," another whispered. "Everyone knows you're the reason things actually work around here." I appreciated their loyalty, but I just smiled and said it would all work out. Because in 5 days, at the quarterly meeting, Preston was going to stand in front of that same audience, board members, executives, senior staff, and deliver what he thought was a triumphant speech. And then Helena Winters was going to stand up, and everything was going to change. The night before the quarterly meeting, I couldn't sleep. Not from nervousness exactly, more from the weight of what was about to happen. I'd spent 11 years building credibility through work, not politics. Now I was about to step into a role that was entirely political. CEO meant managing boards, investors, public perception, not just operations. Could I actually do this? Was I ready? I thought about Preston, probably sleeping soundly, confident in his position. He had no idea that tomorrow would end his tenure. The board had been meticulous. They prepared documentation, legal opinions, transition plans. They'd secured support from major investors. They'd wargamed every possible reaction. Preston would walk into that meeting believing he was untouchable. He'd deliver his confident performance. And then the floor would drop out from under him. Part of me felt something almost like pity. Then I remembered him pointing at me, calling me a liability in front of everyone. Remembered the systematic way he'd marginalized my work, stolen credit, put the company at risk through his careless decisions. The pity evaporated. This wasn't personal revenge. This was the board making a calculated choice about who could actually lead this company. My phone buzzed. A text from Helena, ready. I typed back, yes. Tomorrow, the applause would shift. Not because I demanded it, but because power had. The quarterly meeting room looked exactly the same as 3 months ago. Same long table. Same executives and board members taking their seats. Same projector screen. Same water pitchers and notepads. Preston arrived exactly on time, perfectly dressed, carrying his presentation materials. He smiled at board members, shook hands, radiated confidence. I sat in my usual seat, midway down the table, neither prominent nor hidden. Preston didn't even glance at me. I was already erased in his mind. The meeting started promptly at 9. Preston launched into his presentation, growth projections, strategic initiatives, market positioning. His slides were slick. His delivery was smooth. He talked about bold leadership and decisive action and transforming the organization. Several executives nodded along. Preston clicked to a slide about organizational restructuring. As I mentioned at the all-hands, we're making significant changes to improve efficiency, he said. Starting with operations, where we need fresh thinking and contemporary approaches. He was building up to announcing my removal. I could see it coming. So could everyone else in the room. People shifted uncomfortably. A few glanced at me sympathetically. Preston continued. Effective next quarter, we'll be implementing a new operational structure that... Preston. Helena's voice cut through his speech. Before you continue, the board has an announcement. Preston stopped mid-sentence. Confusion flashed across his face, quickly replaced by his practiced smile. Of course, though I thought announcements were scheduled for the end of the agenda. This can't wait, Helena said, standing. The room went very quiet. Helena walked to the front of the room with deliberate slowness. Every eye followed her. She didn't look at Preston, who stepped aside uncertainly. The projector switched off. No slides, just Helena standing there. The board has completed a comprehensive leadership evaluation, she began. Over the past 3 months, we've conducted extensive reviews of executive performance, operational effectiveness, and strategic direction. Preston's smile had frozen on his face. We've interviewed staff at all levels. We've examined decision-making processes. We've analyzed actual results versus reported results. We've assessed risk management, client relationships, and organizational culture. The other board members watched impassively. They'd all known this was coming. Based on this thorough evaluation, Helena continued, the board has determined that changes in leadership are necessary. Preston shifted his weight slightly, still smiling, but his eyes had gone cold. The company needs a CEO who understands not just vision, but execution. Not just presentation, but substance. Not just appearance, but reality. I kept my expression neutral, hands folded on the table. Someone who has demonstrated over more than a decade that they can deliver results consistently, build lasting relationships, and make decisions that prioritize the company's long-term health over short-term optics. Preston's smile was slipping now. He looked at the other board members, searching for support or explanation. They looked back steadily, revealing nothing. Helena's eyes swept the room before landing on me, which is why the board has unanimously voted to appoint a new CEO, effective immediately. Preston recovered his composure quickly. His expression shifted to something between confusion and patronizing patience. Helena, I appreciate the board's ongoing oversight, but perhaps this conversation should happen in executive session rather than... We voted yesterday, Helena interrupted. Documentation has been filed. The decision is final. Preston's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was still standing at the front of the room, his abandoned presentation materials scattered on the table. I see, he said carefully. And this new CEO is? Someone already in this room, Helena said. Someone who has been running the operational heart of this company while others focused on appearances. Preston's eyes flickered around the table, calculating. He was looking at the other senior executives, trying to determine which one had maneuvered behind his back. Someone, Helena continued, who has consistently demonstrated the judgment, integrity, and competence this company needs. Preston's gaze still hadn't landed on me. He was looking at the CFO, the Chief Strategy Officer, anyone with a flashier title. Someone who understands that real leadership isn't about commanding rooms. It's about building systems that work. And then Helena turned to look directly at me. The entire room followed her gaze. Preston's face went blank as his eyes finally met mine. I saw the exact moment he understood. The shock, the disbelief, the rage he couldn't quite hide. The board is pleased to announce, Helena said clearly, that our new CEO, effective immediately, is Ms. Taylor Morgan. Applause started. Real applause this time, not the polite golf-clapping Preston had received. Executives stood. Board members smiled. The sound filled the room, and Preston stood frozen at the front, his mouth slightly open, staring at me while everyone else celebrated. Helena gestured for me to join her at the front of the room. I stood slowly, deliberately, and walked to where she stood. As I passed Preston, our eyes met for one brief moment. I saw everything in his face, the shock morphing into understanding, the calculation of what this meant for him, the desperate attempt to find some angle to regain control. But mostly, I saw something I'd never seen in him before, complete uncertainty. He'd built his entire persona on absolute confidence, on the belief that he controlled every narrative, every room, every outcome. Now that foundation had cracked. I didn't smile, didn't gloat, just held his gaze for 2 seconds, long enough to let him know I saw his uncertainty, short enough to show I wasn't interested in humiliating him further. Then I turned away and stood beside Helena. Preston stepped back from the front of the room, his presentation abandoned. He moved to the side, no longer the center of attention, suddenly just another person in the room. The applause continued. I raised my hand slightly and it quieted. "Thank you," I said. My voice was steady, calm, unremarkable. "I'm honored by the board's confidence." I looked around the room at faces I'd worked with for years. "I know this is unexpected for many of you, but I want to be clear, this isn't about one person replacing another. It's about ensuring this company has the leadership it needs for sustained success." I didn't look at Preston. Didn't need to. I'll be meeting with all department heads individually over the next week. For now, continue your excellent work. Nothing changes except our commitment to doing things right. I paused. Questions. Silence. Not the uncertain silence from 3 months ago. A different kind. Respectful. Attentive waiting. I nodded to Helena and returned to my seat. The meeting continued, but everything had fundamentally shifted. Helena returned to the agenda without drama. "The board will now address the leadership transition details," she said, pulling up new slides. Preston still stood off to the side, neither sitting down nor leaving. He was trapped in that room, forced to witness the systematic dismantling of his authority. "Mr. Hartwell has served the company for 6 years," Helena continued, her tone professional and impersonal. "The board appreciates his contributions." A pause. However, the leadership review identified significant concerns about strategic judgment, operational oversight, and alignment with company values. I watched Preston's face. He was trying to maintain his composure, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "Mr. Hartwell will be transitioning out of his role over the next 30 days. The board has prepared a separation agreement that we'll review with him privately after this meeting." She moved to the next slide. "In the interim, all executive reporting will flow through our new CEO. Ms. Morgan will be meeting with each of you to discuss priorities and expectations." The other executives were taking notes, asking clarifying questions, already adapting to the new reality. Preston finally moved. He walked stiffly to his seat at the head of the table, except it wasn't his seat anymore. Someone had already placed his materials in a box beside the chair. He stared at the box for a long moment. Then he picked it up, turned without a word, and walked out of the conference room. The door closed behind him with a quiet click. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Helena simply said, "Let's continue," and the meeting moved forward as if nothing had happened. I stayed in that meeting for another 90 minutes, listening to department reports, asking questions, beginning the work of actually leading this company. But my mind kept returning to that moment, Preston staring at the box of his belongings, understanding that it was already over. No fight, no chance to negotiate, just done. When the meeting finally ended, executives lingered to congratulate me. Some seemed genuinely pleased. Others looked nervous, probably wondering if I'd remember every time they dismissed my input or laughed at Preston's jokes about me. I was polite to everyone, professional, gave nothing away about what I was thinking. After they left, Helena asked me to stay. "That went well," she said when we were alone. Preston took it better than I expected. He didn't take it at all. I corrected gently. He just couldn't process it fast enough to react. "True." She studied me. "Are you ready for what comes next? He's going to try to salvage this. Call board members, investors, anyone who'll listen. He'll frame this as a coup. I know. And he'll attack you specifically. Your experience, your leadership style, your qualifications. He'll make it personal. I nodded. I'm ready. Helena smiled slightly. I believe you are. But Taylor, it was the first time she'd used my first name. Being CEO means sometimes making decisions that hurt people. Good people. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the past 3 months. About watching Preston humiliate me while I stayed silent. About building the case against him piece by piece. About choosing the long game over immediate satisfaction. Yes, I said. I'm prepared. The board's formal announcement went out that afternoon. An email to all staff, followed by a press release to industry media. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My inbox flooded with congratulations, questions, concerns. The company's Slack exploded with speculation. Industry analysts published hot takes within hours. But the most important communication came from Helena in a company-wide memo that went out at 5 p.m. It explained the leadership review in careful detail, the concerns that prompted it, the process the board followed, the criteria they used for evaluation. It included specific examples of operational issues that had been hidden or misrepresented. It showed patterns of decision-making that prioritized appearance over substance. It didn't name Preston explicitly for every problem. It didn't need to. The documentation spoke for itself. But the memo also highlighted specific accomplishments, projects that had succeeded despite leadership challenges, teams that had delivered results without proper support, systems that had held together through neglect. My name appeared frequently, not taking credit, but showing where the actual work had happened. The memo ended with a simple statement. The board believes Ms. Morgan has demonstrated the judgment, integrity, and operational excellence necessary to lead this company forward. We ask for your patience and support during this transition. It was devastating in its restraint. No emotion, no drama, just facts, carefully presented. And it made Preston's dismissal look not like a power play, but like an inevitable correction. Preston didn't go quietly. Within hours of the announcement, he called 3 board members directly, demanding explanations and disputing the review findings. They referred him to the separation agreement and declined to engage. He reached out to 2 major investors, suggesting the board had acted rashly and suggesting they intervene. The investors called Helena for clarification. After seeing the full documentation, they supported the board's decision. He tried calling me directly. I didn't answer. He sent an email demanding a meeting to discuss the situation professionally. I forwarded it to our legal counsel without responding. By the second day, he'd hired a lawyer and was threatening litigation. The board's attorneys responded with a detailed letter outlining the comprehensive documentation of his performance issues, the unanimous board vote, and the valid termination clauses in his contract. The threat stopped. What he couldn't do, what he never managed to do, was rebuild his narrative. Too many people had seen the gap between his presentations and reality. Too many staff members had experienced his leadership firsthand. Too many clients had dealt with promises he couldn't keep. The industry, but wasn't, successful CEO wrongfully removed. It was board corrects leadership mistake, and operational executive gets deserved promotion. His attempt at damage control only made him look desperate. On his 4th day, he stopped coming to the office. His assistant cleared out his desk. The executive floor felt lighter without his presence. But I knew this wasn't over. Preston's ego wouldn't accept this. He'd keep trying to undermine me, to prove the board wrong, to salvage his reputation. I'd need to watch for it. My first act as CEO was a company-wide video call. I'd spent 2 days preparing, working with communications staff to strike exactly the right tone. Not triumphant, not apologetic, just clear about the path forward. I stood in front of the camera in my regular office, not the CEO's suite. I know the past few days have been disorienting, I began. Leadership changes always are. But I want to be very clear about what this means for you, for your work, and for this company. I paused. First, this isn't about personality conflicts or politics. The board conducted a thorough review because they saw gaps between what was being presented and what was actually happening. They chose leadership they believe can close those gaps. I looked directly at the camera. Second, nothing about the company's core mission has changed. We build exceptional products. We serve our clients with integrity. We create value. That continues. Another pause. What will change is how we operate. We're going to prioritize sustainable growth over impressive presentations. Long-term relationships over short-term wins. Operational excellence over optical excellence. I let that sink in. I know my leadership style is different. I'm not charismatic. I don't make bold proclamations. What I do is work, methodically, consistently, honestly. I expect the same from everyone here. I smiled slightly. If you've been succeeding by doing solid work without fanfare, nothing changes for you. If you've been succeeding by looking good in meetings while others did your work, this is going to be uncomfortable. A few people laughed. Questions and concerns should go through your department heads. I'll be meeting with teams over the coming weeks. Thank you for your patience during this transition. The call ended. Initial reactions in Slack were positive. People appreciated the directness. But I knew the real test would come in the weeks ahead. The board's separation agreement with Preston was finalized on day 7. He would leave immediately, receiving 6 months severance and maintaining his vested equity, but forfeiting any unvested options. He would sign a non-disparagement agreement and agree not to compete for 18 months. The agreement also included a detailed documentation clause. He acknowledged receipt of the performance review findings and waived any claims of wrongful termination. His lawyer tried to negotiate better terms. The board declined. He had no leverage. On his final day, Preston cleaned out the CEO office personally. Security waited in the hallway. I didn't watch. Didn't need to see his exit to know it was happening. But one of the facility staff told me later that Preston had paused at my office door on his way out. Stood there for a long moment, staring at the nameplate that still read Senior VP of Operations. Then he left without knocking. I had the nameplate changed that afternoon. Taylor Morgan, Chief Executive Officer. Simple. Professional. Real. Preston's departure left gaps in the executive team. People he promoted who couldn't actually do their jobs without his protection. Over the next 2 weeks, I quietly restructured. Some people moved into roles that better suited their skills. Others were offered generous exit packages. I promoted from within wherever possible, elevating people who'd been doing excellent work without recognition. The changes weren't dramatic. No purge, no vendetta. Just corrections. Building a team based on competence rather than loyalty to the previous regime. The company stabilized faster than the board expected. Turns out when you stop spending energy on political maneuvering, you can focus on actual work. The emails started arriving 3 weeks after the announcement. Messages from employees I'd worked with over the years. I'm so glad you're in charge now. Preston made this place exhausting. Thank you for finally bringing sanity back to leadership. I was planning to leave. Now I'm staying. But also, are you going to remember that I laughed when Preston called you a liability? I'm worried I'm on some kind of list for not supporting you enough. Can we meet? I want to explain my position during all of this. I read every message, responded to most, made it clear I wasn't interested in score settling or loyalty tests. What mattered was work going forward, not political positioning in the past. The business press coverage was mostly positive. Operations expert takes CEO role after board review, read one headline. From behind the scenes to center stage, Taylor Morgan's unlikely path to CEO, read another. A few articles question my lack of traditional CEO experience. No MBA, no previous CEO roles, no high-profile strategic wins. One columnist wrote, Morgan's appointment represents a bet that operational competence can translate to executive leadership. History suggests this is risky. I didn't respond to any of it, just kept working. One evening, about a month after taking over, I was reviewing quarterly projections when Helena called. How are you holding up? She asked. Honest answer. Exhausted. Overwhelmed. But handling it. Good. That's the right answer. Anyone who says being CEO is easy isn't doing it right. She paused. The board is pleased, Taylor. You're exceeding expectations. Thank you. But remember, the honeymoon period ends fast. In 3 months, people will stop cutting you slack. In 6 months, you'll own every problem. In a year, no one will remember Preston. It'll all be on you. I understand. Good. Because that quarterly meeting where he called you a liability, That was the easy part. Now comes the hard work. She was right, of course. But I was ready. 6 months into my tenure as CEO, I found myself back in that same conference room for another quarterly meeting. Same table, same board members, but everything else had changed. The company's performance had stabilized. Client retention was up. Staff turnover was down. We'd quietly fixed several operational issues that Preston had ignored. Nothing dramatic, just steady, consistent improvement. I presented our results without flourish. No slick slides, no bold claims, just honest data and realistic projections. The board asked sharp questions. I answered them directly. When the presentation ended, there was applause, but it felt different than before. Not performative or political, just professional acknowledgement of solid work. After the meeting, I walked back to my office and paused at the door. I remembered standing in that hallway 6 months ago, watching Preston humiliate me. Remembered the cold certainty that had settled over me in that moment. People often asked if I felt vindicated, if I savored Preston's downfall. The honest answer was no. Vindication suggested I'd been trying to prove something to him. But I hadn't been. I'd just been doing my job while he played politics. The board eventually noticed the gap between his performance and reality. What happened after that was inevitable. The real satisfaction wasn't his fall. It was knowing that competence had finally mattered more than charisma. That substance had won over style. That patience had beaten arrogance. I thought about Preston sometimes. Wondered if he understood what had gone wrong. If he'd learned anything. Probably not. People like him rarely did. They just moved on to the next role, the next company, the next opportunity to charm their way into positions they weren't qualified for. But that wasn't my concern anymore. My concern was leading this company well. Honestly, sustainably. A year after that humiliating quarterly meeting, Preston's name rarely came up anymore. He'd landed at a smaller company, making the same promises and same mistakes. The industry watched with knowing smiles. Meanwhile, I'd grown into the CEO role in ways I hadn't expected. It was harder than operations. More politics, more pressure, more loneliness. But it was also more meaningful. I could shape the company's direction, its culture, its values. One afternoon, I was preparing for a board meeting when my assistant buzzed. "Someone here to see you. Preston Hartwell. He doesn't have an appointment." I considered sending him away. Then curiosity won. "Send him in." Preston walked into my office looking smaller somehow. Still well-dressed, still confident in appearance. But something fundamental had changed. "Taylor," he said. "Thank you for seeing me." I gestured to a chair. He sat. "I won't take much of your time," he began. "I just wanted to say," he stopped. Started again. "I wanted to say I understand now. What I did wrong. How I led. What I missed." I waited, saying nothing. "You were right. About everything." And I was so focused on looking successful that I never actually did the work to be successful. He met my eyes. "I'm sorry. For how I treated you. For calling you a liability. For all of it." I studied him. Was this genuine? Or another performance? Probably both. "I appreciate you coming here," I said finally. "That took courage." He nodded, standing to leave. At the door, he paused. "For what it's worth, you're an excellent CEO. Better than I ever was." After he left, I sat quietly for a moment. Then I turned back to my work. Because that's what mattered. Not Preston's apology, or his acknowledgement. Not vindication or revenge. Just the work. Building something that lasted. Leading with integrity. Earning trust through consistency, not charisma. The loudest revenge, I'd learned, wasn't shouting or humiliation. It was simply being excellent at what you do. Patiently, quietly, undeniably, until the applause shifted. Not because you demanded it, but because you'd earned it.